and this is the first video in a series which looks at arcade and 16-bit games where you just had to make do with the 8-bit versions, which were often a little bit inferior, let's say. Let's kick things off with a look at Street Fighter 2, a masterpiece which has stood the test of time. And it's a game that's still hugely popular and has received numerous re-releases across pretty much every platform going. The very first version of Street Fighter 2, The World Warrior, if you're somehow not familiar with the game, it's a one-on-one competitive fighter which took the arcades by storm back in 1991. It had 8 playable characters to choose from, each with their own story, fighting style and special moves, which meant there was pretty much a strategy to be considered when you were up against each character, each possessing distinct strengths and weaknesses. My first experience of Street Fighter 2 was in the summer of 1992. There was a small independent game store which had just bought in a World Warrior arcade machine, which conveniently I passed every day on the way to and from school, and I'd pretty much spend all my spare change on that machine. Soon enough, it was announced that Street Fighter 2 was being released on the SNES. This created a huge buzz amongst console gamers, with many of those who did not have a SNES buying one especially ready for the game's release. The SNES version was released across Europe in December 1992. The excitement was very bittersweet in that the game was released between £60 and £70 in many shops, which was way out of reach for your average gamer back then, and many like me still owned 8-bit machines, and we were accustomed to paying really no more than $9.99 for a big title. This brings us to the whole point of this video, the 8-bit versions of Street Fighter 2, and having to make do, if you will, if you wanted your hit of Street Fighter 2, but you just couldn't afford a SNES and a copy of the game. We'll be covering 4 versions of the game on the 8-bit systems, the C64 and Spectrum versions, and also the Gameboy Master System. These latter 2 versions were released much later than the original on the SNES. The Master System was only released in Brazil in 1997, since the Master System was actually still hugely popular in Brazil, but it's definitely worth a look if anything, just from a technical standpoint. All of these conversions clearly will have scaled down from the arcade versions. Even the SNES made some compromises, things such as the bonus levels, certain characters, backgrounds, animation frames, the list does go on. But I won't be dwelling too much on all of these points, just to be taking a broad look at each version. Besides, back then you were kind of used to having to make compromises with 8-bit systems, so Street Fighter 2 was always going to be pretty tight in its offering. Now, expectations should really have been grounded at the time. How on earth could an 8-bit system such as the C64 or the Spectrum, coming to the end of their life at that point in time, going to cope with a recently released arcade game with well-drawn, colourful, smooth and speedy action, which the SNES managed to deliver? Perhaps probably naivety as an 11-year-old, but I had real high hopes for the Spectrum. Let's take a look and see how things went down. First up is the Spectrum version. Let's be realistic here, we were never going to see a full colour conversion with huge sprites running at 60 frames per second. But hopes were high with the Spectrum version with the screenshots initially released for reviews. However, impressively sized sprites aside and a small amount of music on the title and character screens, the Spectrum game in motion is when reality really hit home. Although upon first impressions a noble effort, once you get past the fairly well drawn graphics, it is the terrible frames per second, inconsistent collision detection and responsiveness of the controls which make the game virtually unplayable. But these issues were unbelievably the least of the game's worries when compared to not only the initial long load time, but also the fact it had a multi-load where you had to load each section of the game before you could play the next. For example, you had to load level backgrounds from side 2 of the tape, let it run all the way through until it found the right section, because you had no idea at what point in the tape the correct code was stored. When you finally got into the game and finished the fight, you then had to rewind to the beginning of side 1, load up the character select screen again, and basically repeat this ultimately until you were sick of the game and just turned it off. Ultimately, the game was a resounding disappointment, but with the buyer's remorse settling in nicely, you just had to make the best with what you had, while seething with jealousy at those who were playing their more or less arcade-perfect SNES games. I'd give the Spectrum version 1.5 out of 5. Barely playable. Now, the C64 version was a very different approach to the Spectrum effort, mainly because of what was possible between the 2 machines in terms of resolution, sound and the colours available. From the screen grabs in the reviews, whilst there are more colours present, unfortunately the game does not quite make as good a first impression that the Spectrum does in the screen grabs, with the characters being pretty much unrecognisable apart from their colours. There's too much detail being attempted here, which just results in character sprites clashing with the backgrounds. The music is fairly limited, but at least you get music in the game, albeit the same song constantly all the way through. Again, load times in the multi-load system is completely what ruins the game on the C64 like the Spectrum. It just interrupts the flow of the game far too much for it to be even enjoyable. And this isn't just even in retrospect. Even at the time it was being panned in reviews for the loading system. In terms of playing the game, the C64 delivers a welcome smoother experience, with frame rates being much improved over the Spectrum, although at the cost of resolution and the size of the sprites. But I would consider this game semi-playable. The control system and collision detection is what probably ruins it the most though on the C64. But the plus side is, I could move left and right quite easily in this version. The fighting in-game though is a bit of a joke, but it's certainly worth a play on an emulator just so you could attempt the game at least. The C64 version slightly pips the Spectrum version in my mind, so I'm giving it 2 out of 5, because at least you can kind of semi-control the characters with the improved frame rates, although it's by no means perfect at all. The Game Boy version is an interesting one. Not really directly comparable with the C64 and Spectrum. It is still an 8-bit machine, but very much of a different kind of era. But in terms of converting a decent enough version of Street Fighter 2, it did face many similar challenges as the home computer versions did, which is why we're throwing it in here to have a look. Released in 1995, straight off the bat, the Game Boy version has so many things going for it. Yes, it obviously has monochrome graphics, but it pulls off everything else which the home computer versions could not. Some things are unfair by comparison with the Game Boy version, as obviously it's on a cartridge so it has no load times, has more memory to store the game in, has the D-pad and 2 fire buttons, but the game is still just a lesson how you could take a game which was way too advanced to a system and kind of convert it down to something which is still just as enjoyable. It is quite jerky with a limited number of frames in the character animation, but crucially the collision detection and controls felt much more like an authentic Street Fighter 2 experience. It is worth noting that the Game Boy version is partially based on Super Street Fighter 2, but unfortunately had E Honda, Delsum and Vega missing from the game. The remaining 9 were playable characters though. Definitely give the Game Boy version a try after you've played the C64 and Spectrum versions. You'll instantly be relieved at how much better the playability is of the game. All in all, a hugely great Street Fighter 2 experience, and considering it's on a portable device in 1995, really not a lot of bad things can be said about this version. This version deserves 4 out of 5 for sure. A few foibles in it in that there's some characters missing and so on, but as far as the limitations of the Game Boy, really impressive. The Master System version of Street Fighter 2 is a bit of an oddity. It was only released in Brazil in 1997 by Tectoy. Tectoy were very much the champions of the Master System in Brazil. They still actually sell a revision of the Master System on their website, which includes over 100 built-in games, so it's still kind of going to this day. So for Tectoy to develop and release a conversion of Street Fighter 2 demonstrated further their continued commitment to the platform, long after it had died elsewhere across the world. Let's start with the positives. The game itself looks amazing for a Master System game. The colour palette is applied well given the limitations, and the sprites are a pretty good size. I've read some opinions online that criticise the game for not being all that visually great and has been dumbed down from the Mega Drive version, but again, not getting carried away, it is a Master System game, so it looks fucking amazing for what it is. Each level has the correct music, which has that classic Master System PSG chip sound. In-game sounds are really limited, but at least there's something to represent a punch or a kick. It does actually have some speech in-game too, at least when you select your character, when the rounds start and when you win or lose. Still a nice touch on a system where speech was rare, and the speech is actually a little bit better than the Mega Drive version. Okay, down to the gameplay. It's okay-ish. Unfortunately, where a lot of love would have been given to the graphics conversion, they just seem to run out of steam with the gameplay. Possibly limitations with the hardware, or just maybe shoddy work, who knows. Either way, it's got that same kind of feeling that the Spectrum and C64 version has, where collision detection is all over the place and the controls just seem to have a mind of their own at times. The game is quite buggy, often you'll find characters stop mid-air afloat, and also the frame rates and animation just don't do anything to help either. This makes controlling the game not quite as hard as the Spectrum and C64, but certainly behind the Game Boy version by a long way. You couldn't stand playing it for too long, otherwise you'd end up with a broken joypad out of frustration for sure. Not a bad effort at a time when the Master System was actually 2 generations old in 1997. But unfortunately, with Street Fighter 2 being all about speed, controls and competitiveness, this is just another version that could not keep up. I'd give this 2.5 out of 5. It definitely edges the C64 and Spectrum, but not maybe the best comparison in the world, but still pretty flawed in a lot of ways. Just not a touch on the Game Boy version though. So, see what you had to put up with as an 8-bit gamer, especially in the early 90s when the 16-bit machines were coming into their own. It didn't really matter though, because you would just keep believing that your purchase was still a great one and carried on playing it in an attempt to convince yourself it really was.
You win!
Thank you for watching this look back at the 8-bit versions of Street Fighter 2. Leave me a comment with your memories too. I'm sure there must be somebody out there who had a good time with the Speccy or C64 version. I'd also be hugely grateful if you enjoyed the video, click like and subscribe to the How to Retro channel to ensure you do not miss future episodes. Thanks again and see you soon.